Hello, everyone. So we're going to move on to part two, the psycho part of the biopsychosocial model of addictions. So this part of the model explores the impact of the psychodynamic forces, learning, motivation, interpersonal interactions, and also one's personality on substance use behaviors. So it is interconnected with the biological and social components of the model. And there are also several theories with this perspective of the model. So first, let's move on to the first one, and this is the oldest one, the moral model. So this is one of the very first psychosocial models. Traces back to the temperance movement back in the 1800s. And in this model, and I think we've talked about this before, people with addictions were viewed as being perhaps weak, maybe immoral. They had character flaws, that type of thing. And funny enough, it applied to people with diseases as well. Tuberculosis, TB, was one of the ones that was brought up. In this model, it was that people did not choose their flaws, so it was not totally their fault, but nevertheless, they had flaws. So some segments of society, unfortunately, still have this view. So now let's talk about the learning theory. We know that we learn from watching and listening to those around us. That's how we pick up language, and we go from non-speaking babies to articulate college students. We also learn through our interpersonal environment. We are exposed to more and more things as we grow older and as we become adults. We can be exposed to positive things, but we can also be exposed to negative things. Think about if we're exposed to excess use of alcohol or illicit drugs. We are in an environment where the use of these is acceptable, and so we may learn and think that they are acceptable. If an individual misuses alcohol or drugs, they experience pleasure, which reinforces that learning. And it has also been found that the reward potential is strongest when the effects are unpredictable. If the effects of what we did were predictable and the same over and over, would we keep doing it? Well, research has shown that one of the reasons addicts often use drugs that they are not sure of the purity or why they mix drugs and don't only have one drug of choice is because there is that element of the unknown for the individual. And now we have the coping systems theory. So the use of a substance may be to avoid or to cope with a disorder or some sort of trauma. And so it numbs the emotional pain, and people do use to self-medicate. But we also know that as the tolerance develops, then using becomes also a way to avoid withdrawal symptoms. Another theory is the personality defense theories, and this is also about avoiding pain. So we don't like to hear negative things about ourselves. That's normal. So sometimes we revert to some sort of defense mechanism. But when we talk about addiction, it is really all about avoiding the pain. So there are a few prominent defense mechanisms used by people with an SUD, and those are denial, rationalization, projection, and minimizing. So the first one, denial. That is basically refusing to acknowledge something that is threatening to the ego. The person only sees what supports his or her desire and avoids recognizing those things that does not support their desire. So think of comments like, I can control it whenever I want to. I can quit whenever I want to. Those are denial type comments. And then what about projection? So that's another classic defense mechanism. And what the person is hearing is just unacceptable, so they project it back onto someone else. And the key here is really to avoid accountability of any sort. So a common statement that you might hear is, see what you made me do. So no accountability of oneself and put it back onto another person. The next one is rationalization. So basically here, we're just trying to justify unacceptable behaviors. So think of something like, how can a natural plant be dangerous or addictive? Well, we all know they can, but that's an attempt at rationalization. And then minimization. So basically it's consciously or unconsciously trying to reduce the incidence of an unacceptable behavior or the effects of that behavior on others. So think of things that you might hear like, I only drink on the weekends, that type of response. But they don't really offer that maybe for them the weekend begins on Thursday night and doesn't end till Monday morning. So that's again minimizing. Or perhaps suggesting that they only had 2 drinks when clearly they had many more than that. Again, minimizing. So now we have the behavioral psychology theories. So if we remember from part 1 of the biopsychosocial model, we talked about the behavior determinist theory. And that is where animals and humans work to reduce comfort and to increase pleasure. And that's called the stimulus. The individual's response to the stimulus is called the response. So when we have positive reinforcers, those are things that increase the pleasure or decrease the discomfort. Things that do the opposite are called negative reinforcers. So how much behavior is reinforced can result in either a habit being formed or the lack of a reinforcer can result in the extinction of a behavior. We can certainly see how that would apply to substance misuse. Now we have cognitive behavioral theories. The goal of CBT is to help the person to be able to identify their thoughts in reaction to a specific event, and then figure out how do those thoughts contribute to the person's emotional response, and also recognize when thoughts are dysfunctional, and then obviously learn how to replace those dysfunctional thoughts with more appropriate thoughts. And then, of course, we also want people to learn to continue to monitor when they're having dysfunctional or irrational thoughts. So let's use an example. So let's say a person has a disagreement with someone and their thoughts automatically go to, I fight with everyone, no one likes me, that kind of thing. Well, obviously that is just not very likely, not very rational, and probably totally untrue. So CBT would help the person to have more rational thoughts around that disagreement. So now we have psychoanalysis, and this is a strongly deterministic theory. And it's around what motivates behaviors. So past interpersonal relationships do, unresolved conflict does, and that motivation can be either conscious or unconscious. And for this theory, the therapeutic relationship is really key for change to happen. And we know that many people who suffer from AUDs have been abused in some way. And so because of that, it can be really, really hard for a client to develop rapport and the type of rapport that's needed for a psychoanalytic relationship. However, if that relationship is developed, then what it seems to happen is that neuroplasticity takes place. And if you remember what neuroplasticity is that is when there's changes in the neural pathways. And so if those changes do occur and those networks are altered, then learning can occur. Now we have something called the addictive personality. So this is a strongly deterministic view. And in the minds of some therapists, there is something called an addictive personality. And therapists would say that there's some similar personality traits that are seen to be predictors of alcoholism. And those traits that you can see below here are things like not conforming, aggression, rebelliousness, impulsivity, or thrill seeking. Now, we're going to start here and we're going to talk about some of the reactions or the criticisms to the different models that we've discussed so far. So first of all, the reactions to that moral model where where people are talked about as being perhaps flawed. So this moral model is really about personal prejudice and maybe even about stereotypes, but it really has no basis at all as a model. And remember when we talked about Jelnik back in the bio part, the first PowerPoint, and all the work that he did trying to take that theory and make it a medical concept so that it wasn't about people's flaws or immorality. So basically, this whole model belongs in the archives. Next, what about the addictive personality that we just talked about a few minutes ago? So basically, there are some personality characteristics that do overlap with addictions, but there's really not enough research or evidence to support this theory. So we want to talk about the last two theories and the challenges and criticisms with regards to them. So first of all, the character defense theory. So do people with SUDs use defense mechanisms more than anyone else? Well, we all use defense mechanisms at times, and if people have nothing to fear and there's no consequences to being truthful, then they are more likely to be truthful. There's also what's known as the illusion of correlation, and so we wonder if that is at work here. And what that means is that we tend to remember things that confirm our preconception, and we either forget or we just totally dismiss information that does not confirm our preconception. Then when we look at behavioral psychology, so imagine if an individual is clinically depressed. How hard would it be for them to learn a new behavior or a new way of thinking while they're in that state of mind? And in many studies, this is another really interesting thing. In many studies that have been done on this approach, we use animals and they're tested in a very stark environment. So if you remember or are familiar with the study where rats are in a cage and they have a lever where they can push water and a lever where they can get administered cocaine. The rats forgot about the water almost totally and just continued to press the cocaine lever over and over again. And we assumed that was because they enjoyed and got pleasure from the cocaine. However, there's been some criticism against that kind of study because those animals, those rats, were in a cage that had very little else besides those two levers, one for water, one for cocaine. So we have to wonder if they were maybe just simply bored. And so cocaine obviously was a better choice in that circumstance. They've done more testing where they have put rats in a cage where it was a very different environment. It was a much richer environment. And again, the same levers, one for water, one for cocaine. And there was definitely a significant difference on the number of rats who chose to use the cocaine lever. So there is some criticism on that. And lastly, around using animals, can we be sure that we can apply animal behavior to human behavior? So all really good things to consider when we look at these different theories. And that about sums it up for the part two, the psycho of the biopsychosocial model.